The massive lecture hall of the Galactic Academy buzzed with the quiet hum of anti-gravity chairs and holographic displays. Towering crystal walls stretched up toward a dome that showed the swirling colors of the Andromeda Nebula beyond. Students from across the galaxy filled the tiered seating, tentacled Zorathians clicking their beaks in discussion, crystalline Vex-high beings pulsing with soft light, and hulking Braxon warriors whose metal implants gleamed under the artificial suns. Professor. Kethron strode into the chamber with the unmistakable swagger of Valterian superiority. His species had ruled mathematical sciences for over 3 millennia, and his 4 golden eyes never let anyone forget it. Each eye moved independently, scanning his students like targeting systems on a battle cruiser. The geometric patterns covering his blue-scaled skin seemed to shift and dance, a sign of his elevated status among his people. In the back corner, almost hidden behind a massive Kraxon student whose shell-like armor clinked softly with each breath, sat a lone human. Jiho looked impossibly small compared to his alien classmates. While others manipulated holographic interfaces with tentacles, claws, or psychic energy, he simply used an old-fashioned stylus on a basic tablet. His black hair fell across his forehead as he bent over his notes, completely absorbed in his work. The other students barely acknowledged his presence. Humans were still newcomers to galactic society. Their planet had only joined the Confederation 50 years ago. Most species viewed them as curious, but ultimately limited creatures. They couldn't breathe methane like the Zephyrians, didn't have the collective consciousness of the hive minds, and certainly couldn't process mathematics at the speed of a Valterian neural cluster. Ketheron had been teaching at the Academy for 200 years. He'd seen thousands of species attempt to grasp the complexities of hyperspace mathematics. The Andromedans were decent with theoretical work. The Cetacean League had surprising intuition for quantum mechanics. But humans? They were adequate, at best, usually struggling with anything beyond basic 3-dimensional calculations. This particular human had been attending his classes for 3 months now. Jiho never asked questions, never participated in discussions, never even made eye contact. He simply sat in the back, taking his careful notes, while more advanced students debated the finer points of multidimensional theory. The professor had noticed him attempting some of the homework problems on his tablet, but the work was always turned in late and showed clear signs of struggle. Perfect, Kethron thought, as his eyes focused on the young man. Today's lesson would be particularly challenging. 12-dimensional calculus applications used in the navigation systems of the fastest starships in the galaxy. Even his best students found this material difficult. A human would be completely lost. The professor's teaching assistant, a mechanical being called Unit 7, whose circuits sparked with approval, activated the main holographic display. Immediately, the air above the students' heads filled with swirling mathematical equations that seemed to dance and rotate in impossible patterns. The equations were beautiful in their complexity, spiraling fractals that described how massive starships could fold space-time itself to travel between distant worlds. Today we shall explore 12-dimensional calculus applications in hyperspace navigation, Kethron announced, his voice carrying across the hall with the deep resonance that made Valterians such effective speakers. The universal translators embedded in each student's desk converted his words into hundreds of different languages simultaneously. Several students shifted excitedly in their seats. This was advanced material, the kind of mathematics that separated the truly gifted from the merely talented. The Zorathians' tentacles writhed with anticipation. The Vex-high beings pulsed brighter, their crystalline forms resonating with intellectual excitement. But as Kethron's 4 eyes swept across the room, he noticed something interesting. While the advanced students leaned forward eagerly, the human in the back corner had gone very still. Jiho's stylus had stopped moving across his tablet. His shoulders seemed to tense slightly, and for just a moment, the professor caught a glimpse of something unexpected in the young man's expression. Was that recognition impossible? No human could instantly grasp the implications of 12-dimensional mathematics. They barely understood their own 3-dimensional world properly. Kethron's scales rippled with amusement. This would be even more entertaining than he'd hoped. Not only would he demonstrate human mathematical limitations, but he'd caught this particular student off guard. The boy had probably been daydreaming about his primitive homeworld instead of paying attention to the lesson introduction. Unit 7's mechanical voice chimed softly. "Professor, shall I initialize the practice problem?" "Matrix?" "Not yet," Kethron replied, his four eyes now locked onto Jiho like a predator studying prey. "First, I believe we need a volunteer to demonstrate their understanding of the basic principles." The lecture hall fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems and the distant sound of starships launching from the Academy's orbital platforms. Every student knew what was coming next. The silence in the lecture hall became thick and heavy, like the atmosphere on a gas giant before a storm. Every alien eye, sensor, and consciousness in the room turned toward the back corner where Jiho sat frozen in his chair. The young human's knuckles had gone white as he gripped his stylus, and for a moment it looked like he might simply refuse to move. "Human Jiho," Kethron called out again, each word carefully pronounced to maximize the embarrassment. His four golden eyes gleamed with cruel anticipation as he savored the moment. "We are waiting. Surely you can manage to walk to the front of the class." The massive Kraxan student sitting in front of Jiho shifted his armored bulk to the side, creating a clear path to the front. His shell plates scraped against each other with a sound like grinding metal, and when he looked back at the human, there was something almost like sympathy in his compound eyes. Even the warrior species recognized a setup when they saw one. Jiho's chair made a soft hiss as he finally stood up. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced himself to take the first step down the sloped aisle. Behind him, he could hear the whispered conversations starting up. The Zorathians were clicking their beaks in what sounded like amusement. A group of crystalline Vex-high beings were pulsing with colors that his universal translator couldn't quite decode, but their meaning was clear enough. As he walked, the holographic display above the classroom suddenly exploded with mathematical complexity. The equation that materialized was absolutely massive, a three-dimensional web of symbols, variables, and calculations that twisted and turned through virtual space like a living thing. It was the kind of problem that would take a team of Valterian mathematicians hours to solve, even with their advanced neural processing capabilities. The equation dealt with hyperspace navigation for a fleet of dreadnought-class battleships, massive vessels that could carry entire armies between star systems. Each ship was over 2 kilometers long and required incredibly precise calculations to avoid colliding with asteroids, space stations, or other vessels when they dropped out of hyperspace. One small mistake in the math could send a battleship crashing into a planet or worse, into the heart of a star. Several students in the front rows actually leaned back in their seats as the holographic numbers seemed to reach toward them. A young Andromedian female covered her face with her tentacles, overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of what she was seeing. Even Unit 7, the mechanical teaching assistant, seemed to process the information more slowly than usual, his circuits sparking with extra effort. "This particular equation," Kethron announced to the class, his voice filled with theatrical drama, "represents the navigation calculations for a full battle fleet performing a synchronized hyperspace jump into the Rigel system. As you can see, it requires mastery of 12-dimensional mathematics, quantum probability matrices, and temporal displacement theory." Jiho had reached the front of the classroom now, standing directly beneath the swirling mathematical nightmare that hung in the air above him. The holographic numbers cast strange shadows across his face, making him look even younger and more out of place than before. His simple human clothing, just a basic academy uniform, looked primitive compared to the advanced environmental suits, biomechanical implants, and energy fields that his classmates wore. "The standard Valterian solution method," the professor continued, gesturing with one of his forearms toward a secondary display, "involves 17 distinct calculation phases and typically requires a team of trained mathematicians working in neural sync. But perhaps our human friend has a simpler approach." The laughter that erupted from the alien students was like nothing Jiho had ever heard before. The Braxon warriors produced deep, rumbling sounds that made the floor vibrate. the Zephyrians created high-pitched whistles that hurt his ears. Even the usually dignified cetacean delegates were making sounds that their translators rendered as barely contained amusement. But it wasn't just laughter. There was genuine curiosity mixed in with the mockery. Many of these students had never seen a human attempt advanced mathematics before. Some had never even met a human in person. Earth was still considered a backwater world by most galactic standards, a planet of primitive beings who had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. "Professor," Jiho said quietly, his voice barely audible over the dying laughter. "May I use a different approach than the standard Valterian method?" The question seemed to surprise everyone in the room. Several students stopped laughing entirely, suddenly interested in what the human might be thinking. Did he actually believe he could solve this problem? Did he have some kind of death wish? Kethron's laugh echoed through the chamber like the roar of a spacecraft engine. It was a sound filled with pure, undiluted arrogance, the laugh of a being who had never been wrong about anything in his long life. His 4 eyes practically glowed with delight as he realized the human was going to make this even more entertaining than he'd hoped. "By all means, human," he said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mock generosity. "Show us your primitive human mathematics. I'm sure we could all use a good laugh before we tackle the real work." Unit 7's mechanical head tilted slightly, his optical sensors focusing on Jiho with what might have been concern. The teaching assistant had been programmed to help students learn, and something about this situation seemed to be triggering his protective protocols. But before he could speak, Kethron gestured for silence. The holographic display pulsed brighter, waiting for input. Jiho stood directly beneath it, looking impossibly small and fragile compared to the massive mathematical structure hanging over his head. His hands were no longer trembling, though. Something had changed in his posture during the walk to the front of the class. He reached up toward the holographic interface, and the entire classroom held its breath. Jiho stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes scanning the massive holographic equation that twisted and pulsed above his head. The mathematical structure was so complex that it seemed almost alive, with variables flowing like liquid mercury through dimensional spaces that hurt to look at directly. Most students would have been paralyzed by the sheer scope of the problem, but something strange was happening to the young human. His breathing had slowed and deepened, as if he was entering some kind of meditative state. The trembling in his hands had completely stopped. When he finally reached toward the holographic interface, his movements were smooth and deliberate, like a master craftsman approaching a familiar tool. The first thing he did surprised everyone in the room. Instead of diving into the complex, Valterian formulas that covered the secondary displays, Jiho began to strip away layers of the equation. His fingers moved through the holographic space, isolating certain variables and setting others aside. It was like watching someone carefully disassemble an incredibly complicated machine, removing unnecessary parts to reveal the essential mechanisms underneath. "What is he doing?" whispered a Zorathian student in the 3rd row, her tentacles writhing with confusion. The universal translator barely caught her words, but the bewilderment in her voice was clear to everyone. Professor Kethron's 4 eyes narrowed as he watched the human work. This wasn't what he had expected at all. The boy should have been stumbling through basic calculations by now, making elementary mistakes that would prove human mathematical inferiority once and for all. Instead, Jiho was approaching the problem from an angle that the Valterian professor had never seen before. The young man's hands moved faster now, manipulating the holographic symbols with growing confidence. Where the original equation had been a tangled mess of interdependent variables, patterns were beginning to emerge. Jiho was finding connections between seemingly unrelated parts of the calculation, drawing lines of relationship that created a web of elegant simplicity within the chaos. A soft gasp echoed from somewhere in the middle of the classroom. One of the advanced Andromedian students had realized what she was seeing. The human wasn't just solving the equation. He was revealing the underlying mathematical poetry that the Valterian method had buried under layers of unnecessary complexity. At the back of the lecture hall, the heavy doors slid open with barely a whisper. A young woman stepped inside, trying to move quietly so as not to disturb the class. Minji was a human exchange student from the engineering department, and she had only intended to observe for a few minutes before her next class. But as soon as she saw her fellow human standing at the front of the room, working with holographic mathematics that seemed far beyond anything taught on Earth, she froze in place. She knew Jaiho from the Human Student Association meetings. He Kai was quiet, studious, and had never mentioned being particularly gifted at mathematics. In fact, most of the human students at the academy struggled with the advanced alien mathematics courses. The computational methods used by other species were so different from human approaches that it usually took years just to understand the basic concepts. But what she was watching now defied everything she thought she knew about human capabilities. In this field, Jaiho had begun to rebuild the equation, but in a completely different form. Instead of the massive, unwieldy structure that had filled the air above the classroom, he was creating something that looked almost organic. The new mathematical model flowed and curved like the hull of a sleek starship, with each component fitting perfectly into the whole. The crystalline Vex-high beings in the front row were pulsing with rapid flashes of light, their equivalent of excited conversation. Their species communicated primarily through color and brightness, and right now they were practically blazing with amazement. They had recognized something in Jaiho's work that resonated with their own crystalline mathematical intuition. Even Unit 7, the mechanical teaching assistant, had stopped his routine maintenance protocols to focus entirely on what the human was doing. His optical sensors were recording everything, but his processing system seemed to be struggling to analyze the unconventional approach. The android's head tilted at an angle that suggested deep confusion mixed with growing fascination. The breakthrough came when Jaiho identified a recursive pattern hidden deep within the hyperspace navigation calculations. It was something that should have been impossible to spot without advanced neural enhancement, but somehow the young human had found it through pure intuition and mathematical insight. Once he isolated this pattern, the entire equation began to collapse into manageable segments. What had originally been a problem requiring 17 distinct calculation phases suddenly became something that could be solved in just 4 elegant steps. The solution wasn't just correct, it was beautiful in its simplicity, revealing mathematical truths that had been hidden by the traditional Valterian approach for centuries. The classroom had fallen into absolute silence. Even the background hum of life support systems seemed muted as hundreds of alien minds tried to process what they were witnessing. Advanced students who had spent years mastering traditional methods were seeing their entire understanding of mathematics turned upside down by a quiet human who had never even spoken in class before. Minji found herself holding her breath as she watched Jaiho work through the final calculations. Her own engineering training had given her enough mathematical background to understand the basics of what he was doing, but the sophistication of his approach was beyond anything she had encountered. This wasn't just problem-solving. It was mathematical artistry of the highest order. The holographic display pulsed once, twice, and then settled into a steady glow as the solution locked into place. The massive battlefleet navigation problem that should have taken a team of Valterian experts hours to solve had been completed in less than 15 minutes by a single human student using methods that no one else in the room had ever seen before. The moment Jaiho completed the navigation equation, something extraordinary happened. Instead of stepping back to accept the stunned silence of his classmates, he remained at the holographic interface, his eyes still focused on the mathematical structures floating in the air above him. His fingers moved again, but this time he wasn't solving a problem. He was expanding on his solution in ways that no one had expected. "Wait," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent lecture hall. "This pattern, it's not limited to single fleet navigation. Look at this." With swift, confident movements, Jaiho began to manipulate the holographic display, extending his elegant solution into new dimensions. What had started as a navigation problem for one battle fleet suddenly bloomed into something much larger. The mathematical model expanded, showing how the same principles could be applied to coordinate the movements of hundreds of starships simultaneously across multiple star systems. The implications hit the advanced students first. A cetacean delegate in the front row made a sound that his translator rendered as pure amazement. The whale-like being's massive form trembled as he realized what he was seeing. A solution to the galaxy fleet's most persistent logistical nightmare. For over 3 centuries, the Galactic Confederation had struggled with coordinating large-scale military operations across vast distances. Moving battle fleets from one sector to another required months of careful planning, and often resulted in ships arriving at different times, leaving them vulnerable to enemy attacks. The traditional Valterian navigation methods were simply too slow and cumbersome for the kind of rapid deployment that modern warfare demanded. But Jiho's approach changed everything. His mathematical framework revealed shortcuts through hyperspace that could cut travel time by up to 60% while maintaining perfect synchronization between vessels. Even more remarkably, his calculations showed how to compensate for the gravitational interference that had always plagued fleet movements near massive star systems. Professor Keithron's 4 eyes were wide with disbelief as he watched the human work. His blue-scaled skin had lost its usual vibrant color, fading to a pale gray that betrayed his shock. The arrogant confidence that had defined his entire career was crumbling as he realized that this quiet human student had just accomplished something that teams of Valterian mathematicians had been trying to achieve for generations. Unit 7, the mechanical teaching assistant, suddenly began emitting a series of rapid beeps and clicks. His optical sensors were flashing red as his internal systems tried to process the significance of what they were recording. The android's programming had detected mathematical principles that didn't exist in any of his databases, and his confusion. Protocols were overloading. "Professor," Unit 7's voice crackled with electronic static, "I am detecting calculation methods that do not match any known mathematical frameworks. Should I alert the Academy's research division?" Before Kethron could respond, Jiho had moved on to an even more impressive demonstration. The holographic display now showed a 3-dimensional map of known space, with major trade routes highlighted in blue and military patrol paths marked in red. But as the young human continued his calculations, new pathways began to appear, shortcuts through hyperspace that connected distant sectors in ways that had never been considered possible. The current hyperspace lanes were mapped using traditional geometric principles, Jiho explained, his voice growing stronger as his confidence built. But if you approach the problem from a topological perspective, treating space-time as a flexible medium rather than a rigid framework, entirely new possibilities emerge. Minji, still standing at the back of the lecture hall, felt her legs go weak. She grabbed onto a nearby chair for support as she watched her fellow human casually rewrite the fundamental principles of galactic navigation. The engineering courses she had been struggling with suddenly seemed trivial compared to what Jiho was accomplishing with apparent ease. The young man's hands moved through the holographic interface like a conductor directing a cosmic orchestra. Mathematical symbols flowed and danced around him, creating patterns of such beauty and elegance that several students were recording everything with their personal devices. The crystalline Vex-High beings were pulsing so brightly with excitement that they were actually illuminating their section of the lecture hall. Then, Jiho did something that left everyone breathless. He began to show how his navigation principles could be applied to solve other seemingly unrelated problems. Resource allocation across colonial worlds, communication delays between distant outposts, even the optimal positioning of defensive satellites around inhabited planets. All of these challenges yielded to his mathematical approach. But the most stunning revelation came when he demonstrated how his methods could be used to detect and avoid the mysterious spatial anomalies that had been destroying ships throughout the Outer Rim territories. For years, vessels had been vanishing without a trace in certain regions of space, leading to those areas being declared off-limits to civilian traffic. Jiho's calculations revealed that these anomalies followed predictable patterns that could be mapped and avoided using his hyperspace topology theory. The lecture hall had become completely silent except for the soft hum of recording devices and the occasional gasp of amazement from students who understood the implications of what they were witnessing. News of the breakthrough was already spreading beyond the classroom through the Academy's quantum communication network. Professor Veltara from the Advanced Physics Department was the first to arrive, her six-legged form clicking rapidly across the floor as she hurried to witness the phenomenon firsthand. She was followed by Dr. Zexan from Military Strategy, whose cybernetic implants were glowing with data streams as he analyzed Jiho's work in real time. Within minutes, senior researchers from across the academy were filing into the lecture hall. The head of the mathematics department, an ancient Braxton whose shell was decorated with the battle honors of a dozen wars, stood transfixed as he watched the young human continue to expand his theoretical framework. "Impossible," whispered Professor Kethron, but his voice lacked any conviction. The evidence was right there in front of him, undeniable and revolutionary. The primitive human he had intended to humiliate had just changed the course of galactic civilization with nothing more than intuitive mathematical genius. As word spread through the Academy's network, emergency sessions were being called in research departments across multiple star systems. The implications of Jiho's breakthrough extended far beyond simple navigation improvements. They represented a fundamental shift in how advanced civilizations understood the structure of space-time itself. The lecture hall had transformed into something resembling the command center of a massive starship during a critical battle. Senior researchers from every department were crowded around holographic displays, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, electronic beeps, and translated voices. At the center of it all stood Jiho, no longer the quiet, nervous student from the back row, but a young man whose mathematical genius had just shaken the foundations of galactic science. Admiral Thexka of the Galaxy Fleet had arrived within the hour, her massive Draxon form barely fitting through the lecture hall doors. Her battle armor gleamed with the insignia of countless campaigns, and the cybernetic implants covering half her face pulsed with incoming data streams from Fleet Command. She had been in the middle of planning a major operation against pirate strongholds in the Outer Rim when news of the breakthrough reached her flagship. "Young human," she rumbled, her voice like the engines of a dreadnought battleship. "Do you realize what you have accomplished? Your navigation theories could revolutionize military strategy across the entire galaxy. We could deploy relief ships to disaster zones in days instead of weeks. We could coordinate defensive fleets across sectors simultaneously." But it was Professor Kethron's reaction that truly captured everyone's attention. The proud Valtarian had spent the last 2 hours reviewing and re-reviewing Jiho's calculations, his four eyes darting frantically between different displays as he tried to find some flaw, some mistake that would preserve his species' mathematical superiority. Instead, he had discovered layer upon layer of mathematical brilliance that surpassed anything in the Valtarian archives. The truth about Jiho had emerged gradually through conversations with Minji and other human students. He wasn't just gifted, he was a once-in-a-generation mathematical prodigy who had been deliberately hiding his abilities since childhood. On Earth, his extraordinary talents had made him a target for exploitation by corporations and governments who wanted to use his genius for their own purposes. Coming to the Galactic Academy had been his chance to study in peace, to learn about advanced alien mathematics without the pressure of constant scrutiny. "I never wanted the attention," Jiho explained quietly to Dr. Veltara, who had been gently questioning him about his background. "Back on Earth, when people discovered what I could do, my life became impossible. Constant testing, job offers, pressure to solve military problems I didn't want to be involved with. I just wanted to learn and maybe help people in my own way." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. By trying to humiliate the human, Professor Kethron had forced Jiho to reveal abilities that would have remained hidden indefinitely. The young man had felt compelled to defend not just his own honor, but the reputation of humanity itself among the galactic community. Unit 7, the mechanical teaching assistant, had been running continuous analysis protocols on Jiho's work. His optical sensors had captured every gesture, every calculation, every innovative leap of mathematical logic. The android's memory banks now contained what would become the most valuable mathematical data in galactic history. Professor Kethron, Unit 7 announced, his electronic voice carrying across the crowded hall. My analysis indicates that the human's mathematical framework represents a paradigm shift equivalent to the discovery of hyperspace travel itself. The implications extend far beyond navigation into areas of physics, engineering, and even biological sciences. The moment that would become legend throughout the galaxy occurred as the sun was setting over the Academy's crystal spires. Professor Kethron, his pride finally broken by the undeniable evidence of his own prejudice and ignorance, approached Jiho with his 4 eyes downcast. The lecture hall fell silent as the proud Valterian, a being who had never shown deference to anyone in his 200-year career, slowly lowered himself into a formal bow of respect. Young Jiho, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I have spent my entire life believing that mathematical truth belonged to the superior minds of my species. Today, you have shown me that genius recognizes no boundaries of race, species, or origin. I publicly apologize for my arrogance and ignorance. More than that. His voice grew even quieter. Would you consider allowing an old fool to study under your guidance? I have much to learn and perhaps little time left to do so. The silence that followed was profound. Students, professors, and military officials watched as the human considered the Valterian's request. Finally, Jiho smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since his arrival at the Academy. Professor, he said gently, I'd be honored to share what I know, but I hope we can learn from each other. Your experience and knowledge are valuable too. Maybe together we can discover even more. Within days, Jiho's mathematical breakthrough had spread across the galaxy through quantum communication networks. The navigation improvements were implemented by civilian shipping companies first, cutting travel times and reducing fuel costs dramatically. The Galaxy fleet began retrofitting their vessels with new navigation computers based on his calculations. But the impact went far beyond practical applications. Universities across hundreds of worlds began incorporating Jiho's theorem into their curriculum. The mathematical principles he had revealed opened new avenues of research in fields ranging from quantum mechanics to stellar engineering. 5 years later, when the first faster-than-light hospital ship reached a plague-stricken colony world in record time, using Jiho's navigation methods, saving millions of lives, the young human received the Galactic Medal of Honor. 10 years after that, when a coordinated fleet maneuver based on his theories prevented an invasion of the inner systems, he was offered citizenship in dozens of worlds. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on how alien species viewed humanity itself. The phrase, "Never underestimate a human," became common throughout galactic society. Diplomatic protocols were updated to show greater respect for Earth's representatives. Human students found themselves welcomed at advanced institutions across the galaxy. Jiho himself continued his studies, eventually becoming the youngest professor in Academy history. He never forgot the lesson of that day, that brilliance should be used not for personal glory, but to bridge the gaps between different peoples and species. Professor Kethron, true to his word, became Jiho's most dedicated student and closest friend. Together, they established the Intergalactic Institute for Mathematical Cooperation, where beings from all species could study and share knowledge without prejudice. The quiet student from Earth had indeed proven that human ingenuity knew no bounds, but more importantly, he had shown the galaxy that wisdom and humility were just as valuable as genius itself. The end.